Hello students, let us now take a look at the poem Ozymandias, one of the most famous of Shelley's poems, probably not often considered as the most typical of Shelley's works, yet one which conveys in the short form of the sonnet all the power and the rebellion of Shelley's poetic oeuvre. It's a poem that uses the image of a crumbling statue or a crumbled statue to talk about an issue that Shelley held very close to himself, and that is the contrast between the power and the permanence of art and the transience of power, especially political power. Now, as we mentioned in the previous class, Ozymandias, Shelley's sonnet Ozymandias was in fact a poem that he wrote as part of a friendly competition that he engaged in the company of his friend Horace Smith, when they were probably discussing Egyptian culture. There was around that time, the early years of in the 19th century, there was a kind of revival of interest in Egyptian culture, and there were a lot of works coming out on the Egyptian civilization, the ancient empires of Egypt, and the ancient emperors, especially by travelers who traveled to the sites of the ancient Egyptian civilization. And it is probable that Shelley and his friend happened to have a discussion on this civilization, and probably they happened to discuss a particular work in which the statue, the huge, colossal statue of King Ramesses II, who was otherwise known as Ozymandias, came up for reference. So the story goes that Shelley's friend Horace Smith happened to stay with the poet during the Christmas season of the year 1817, and it is believed that they were discussing archaeological findings in various sites of the ancient Egyptian civilization, and it is something that fascinated European imagination around that time, and they probably recalled the work of the historian Diodorus Siculus, who described in one of his works the statue of Ozymandias, or the one who was known as King Ramesses II. One can see the fragments of this huge, colossal statue, as you can see in this image here. And in this work by Diodorus Siculus, we have a reference to the inscription that came along, or that was part of this statue, according to which the inscription read like this: "King of kings, Ozymandias am I. If any want to know how great I am and where I lie, let him outdo me in my work." So during the course of this discussion, or after this discussion, we have Horace Smith, who left us with this poem, which is very crudely called "On a Stupendous Leg of Granite, Discovered Standing by Itself in the Deserts of Egypt, with the inscription inserted below." And on the other hand, you have Shelley coming up with the tiny little poem, the sonnet Ozymandias, which has achieved immortality in its own right. It is a poem where Shelley breaks, as is usual with him, many a convention. In the first place, he breaks the conventions of the sonnet form. The sonnet is a poetic form of Italian origin, and we are familiar with the stanza structure of the Petrarchan sonnet, the octave followed by the sestet with a specific rhyme scheme, which was later probably changed by Shakespeare, who has his own sonnet sequence. Shakespeare changed the structure of the Italian sonnet into three quatrains followed by an epigrammatic couplet. But Shelley, and that too has its own rhyme scheme, but Shelley defies those conventions, and he chooses to use the sonnet form in a different way, as is usual with him. He was never a person who respected any kind of convention, any kind of norm, any kind of rigid, regimentation or instruction. And the same holds good or goes for his stand on power, political power, when it takes a demonic form, when it takes a rather totalitarian form. That is what Shelley opposed all his life long. And you find him using the medium of art to convey his powerful opinion about the meaninglessness and the transience of political power. And when we refer to Ozymandias, we should also probably take a look at a similar work written by Shelley, another sonnet, in fact, England in 1819. In both these works, you have Shelley, the fierce opponent, the fierce denouncer of political power. Shelley, the passionate spokesperson for liberty, the passionate advocate for total freedom. The result of Shelley's political commitment can be seen in these two works, Ozymandias and England in 1819. In the latter poem, England in 1819, you have a description of England during the reign of King George III. He is described as an old, mad, blind, despised, and dying king. And, there's nothing right about the nobility. They are compared to insensible leeches that drain the country dry, and the people are oppressed, hungry, and hopeless. Their fields are untilled. The army is corrupt and dangerous. The laws are useless. And religion, morale, the parliament, all these man-made institutions are simply futile and useless in this situation. So he uses a series of very forceful metaphors to convey his abhorrence, his hatred for these institutions like monarchy, like the parliament, like religion, and so on. So, and as it happens in many Shelleyan work, you have towards the end a very strong note of optimism, that passionate note of optimism, where you feel, that a glorious phantom may burst and illuminate our tempestuous day. This vision of something new that will emerge from the darkness and prevail over it. This is something that is very common to many of Shelley's poems. You can think of a similar idea expressed in Ode to the West Wind. If winter comes, can spring be far behind? Yeah, so let's focus our attention on Ozymandias, which appeared for the first time in The Examiner, a newspaper, on the 11th of January, 1818. And an interesting thing about the sonnet is the pen name or the pseudonym that Shelley used, Glerastes. He was often in the habit of using different pseudonyms, but for this one he used the word Glerastes. That helps us to uh, uh, um, locate the time around which it must have been uh, composed. Glerastes is probably a kind of portmanteau word designed most probably by Shelley himself. It combines the Greek suffix erastes, which means a lover of, and gleride, a Latin word which means a domos. It is said that domos was the name that he often affectionately used to refer to his wife, uh, Mary Godwin. Mary, yeah. So the lover of the domos. That's how he signed this poem. And it was only much later, more than 130 years later, that when certain readers of Shelley's poems discovered some letters written by Shelley and Mary and others, that they discovered the connection, or the meaning behind this pseudonym, Glerastes. So let's take a look at the sonnet, first of all, by looking at its unusual form. Even though it is a sonnet, a 14-line poem written in iambic pentameter, we notice that it takes a different path from the conventional Petrarchan or Shakespearean sonnet. The Petrarchan sonnet, the traditional sonnet, is one that is divided into an octave, an 8-line paragraph, and stanza, and a sestet, a 6-line stanza. And the rhyme scheme normally is ABBA, ABBA, CDE, CDE, or CD, CD, CD. Whereas an Elizabethan or a Shakespearean sonnet had the structure of 3 quatrains followed by a couplet. A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. That is the structure of a Shakespearean sonnet. Now, Shelley strays from these. He sticks to the Petrarchan pattern, probably an octave and a sestet, but we find that he interlinks, the rhyme scheme in such a way that you have a rhyme scheme that goes A, B, A, B, A, C, D, C, E, D, E, F, E, F. So it's a different pattern that Shelley follows, very much in keeping with his unconventional ways of life and poetry. So let's look at the poem now. It begins with the speaker or the persona saying, I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. And then you have a description of the statue or the statue in ruins and its surroundings. So the first thing that we notice is the fact that the sonnet is in the form of a frame story, where you have the speaker or the persona, and the rest of it is spoken by someone else, a traveler from an antique land. So what you notice is that sense of distance. It is not first-hand experience. It's not a poem based on first-hand experience. Of course, we know that Shelley definitely did not travel to any of the sites of the ancient Egyptian civilization to have seen these statues or the colossal statues in ruin. He would only probably have read about them. And therefore, from the very beginning, what you have is a sense of remoteness, a sense of distancing. He probably wants to convey the idea that the subject, of this poem, or the subject, the person, that emperor, the king who had got that huge statue of his erected in the Egyptian desert, is now an insignificant chapter in some remote part of history. It is no longer relevant. It is no longer present in any way in contemporary times. So that remoteness, that distancing is what is highlighted throughout the poem. The frame story or the presenting the story, the sonnet in the form of a frame story achieves that target. So it's a kind of obscurity, the fact that this king has now been rendered obscure, has been forgotten, or remains irrelevant today. So that is what is conveyed. So we only hear about the statue from someone who has heard about it from someone else who has seen it. So all the power and prestige of the power and the prestige of that king, whatever he had during his own lifetime, has now become a mere shadow. It is just not relevant. He has become very much less commanding than and powerful than what he was in his own lifetime. So the distancing helps to or serves to undermine his power, just as his power has been undermined by time, or his statue has been totally erased and destroyed by time. And then we get to see the statue. How do we see it? Not in its magnificence, but we see the shattered visage first. It is the face, the huge, at the head of the statue, which lies half sunk in the desert sand, and you can see the expression clearly. What does the face show? It does not show a very pleasing image. What you have there is a frown and a wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. So these are the expressions that are retained on the statue, in spite of the statue having got dilapidated, having got more or less ruined. These expressions, have remained permanent. There is this angry, cold look on the king's face, which have been aptly captured by the sculptor. The fact that he constantly had a frown on his face, and that, the lips were forever wrinkled in the sense of without a smile. When you smile, your lips stretch and there would be no wrinkles. But here, they are not stretched, as a result of which they are wrinkled, conveying an expression of a very cold, commanding nature. And this, according to the poet, is what the sculptor, the artist in this context, has very clearly captured. So art has that power to capture things, capture facts, capture impressions for eternity. The statue itself, which was erected by the king as a symbol of his power, has got crumbled, has got destroyed, but the expression clearly etched on it by the artist remains permanent. So, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. You have the image there of the sculptor who has fed his heart and his labor into the creation of the statue. So the poem tells us that the sculptor read those passions quite well. The passions that survive, stamped on these things which are lifeless. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. The hand that copied the passions of the king. The hand refers to the sculptor. The sculptor copied for the statue the expressions and the passions of the king. And the heart that fed these expressions. The sculptor putting his heart and soul into his work. And, that is what has been captured for eternity. And then something else is also clear. And that, again, remember, is something that is inscribed on the pedestal of the statue. In other words, it is the written word. Remember, Shelley always upheld poetry, literature as the most powerful weapon. And it is a similar idea that is being conveyed here, where it is through the inscribed words that you get an insight into what that king was and, how he considered himself to be the most powerful being on earth. So what do the words say? My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. It's almost a challenge that Ozymandias throws up to the mighty, the gods probably. He is challenging even the gods. He thinks that by erecting this huge statue which rises heavenward, he would probably be able to um, challenge the gods, and that is what he conveys through this idea, through the words, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. He feels that even the gods would despair looking at the mighty achievements of the king. But then you have the poet coming back to the present, to the the state of the statue now, and says, nothing beside remains. It's only those words that survive. The expressions etched by the sculptor, a work of art, and the inscription again etched by the sculptor, again a work of art. These are the things that survive. Nothing beside remains. Absolutely nothing. Because around the decay of that colossal wreck, all around that huge colossal wreck, you have boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretching far away. Look at the choice of the words and the image conveying that sense of, endless, the boundless and bare sands, desert sands stretching far, far away. Now, what emerges from these endless deserts of vast eternity is the idea of the permanence of art. Because the statue, the symbol of worldly power, everything that is worldly and man-made lies in ruins. But the work of the artist there, that is the expression and the words on the pedestal, these have remained immortal. These have remained unchanged. And it is at that point that we realize how there is another work of art that emerges from these sands. And what is that? That is this very poem itself. Shelley's poem, Ozymandias. When you look at the way this poem has emerged from this scene of the statue of King Ramesses II lying half sunk in the deserts of vast eternity, you realize how that chapter in history, which remains largely forgotten, is one that is largely remembered, or that is remembered, if at all, probably only through the works of poetry like Shelley's Ozymandias. Therefore, the endless sands of this poem represent the threatening expanse of past and future, and from this Shelley's poem arises, and it keeps alive in us the beauty of art, the permanence of art. In his great work, prose work, A Defense of Poetry, Shelley very powerfully declares that it is the poet alone who is capable of creating that which remains permanent. The poet creates humane values and imagines the forms that shape the social order. Thus, each mind, he says, recreates its own private universe, and it is thus that he declares triumphantly that poetry is the most is the most unfailing herald of change. If anything can change the world, that is poetry. And he ends that tract with this important statement: poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. They create a new world. They create the vision of a new world. So what you find embedded in this little poem, little as it is, small as the poem is, it conveys this very powerful message about the timelessness of art, the power of nature over man, the power of poetry over any form of political power. And this kind of timelessness, this kind of permanence, this kind of immortality is something that is the privilege not of any ruler, not of any monarch, not of any earthy institution, but only of um, divine things like poetry and uh, what shall you say, the world of nature itself. So Shelley's sonnet thus becomes a kind of epitome of poesy itself, of a poetry, the art, the very creation of poetry, because this poem has outlasted all that it describes. It is about a statue, it is about a king, it is about somebody who created that statue, but well beyond all those, this poem continues to live. Ozymandias, the poem lives, even though all that fed it, all that gave it the subject, all that gave it the theme have died and perished. So the poem has witnessed the death of many a boastful tyrant, including the ones who were Shelley's contemporaries. It has seen the decline of, worldly power, monarchs, tyrants, the British dominion, all of these, and the poem remains immortal. I think that is what we need to celebrate when we celebrate and acknowledge when we read this poem, the way in which it highlights the immortality and the permanence of art in contrast to everything that belongs to the human world.